We are here today to interview Paul Claval. I am David Hooson of the University of California in Berkeley, United States. Professor Claval is very well known in the Anglophone world because his books have been translated into many languages. He has lectured quite widely throughout the Anglophone world, and he has made a point always of keeping up with the literature in that part of the world outside France. And so it's a great pleasure today to interview you, Paul, and just like to start off with some idea from you about what there was significant in your formative experiences in France.
Oh yes, I was raised in a small city in southwestern France, and in fact I attended school in a small village, and so I have memories of the time when the people were plowing at the low pace of oxen, and it was certainly a very different experience of nowadays. I enjoyed also the experiences with my father, who was an inspector of weight and scales, and have good memories of the marketplaces of southern central Massif, with the possibility to spend a lot of time bargaining, and so I think that are important experiences for a young man, but I'm not sure that it's so important in my own idea of geography. But as far as can remember, I have the desire to be a geographer, and I was spending a lot of time looking at maps, and one of my dreams was to settle later on in a small city in a country which was for me a wonderful one, that is New Zealand. And for me, paradise was certainly in Greymouth, New Zealand, and I was very much disappointed when I visited Greymouth 40 years later.
I know that feeling, exactly the same.
Yes.
So what about, though, your formative steps in geography, or towards becoming interested in geography?
Yes, I attended the university in Toulouse, and I got the classical formation for geographers, that is geography and history. But at the same time, I have different experiences. I spent 1 year studying mathematics. I am not a good mathematician, but it freed me of any fetishism about mathematics, and I think it was very useful for me at the time of the quantitative revolution. I knew that it was possible for me to use these techniques, but I knew that they were only techniques. At the same time, I got training for 2 years in the history of French literature, and I think that there were certainly very good experiences, because the teacher I had at that time was a wonderful teacher of the history of ideas. And I got the feeling that it was important to look at the roots of what you are looking at if you want to understand what is really significant. So I think that my experiences in mathematics, my experiences in the history of ideas were certainly as important as the classical formation I got in geography and in history.
But then when you came very fully into geography in Besançon, or at least in the 60s, when you were writing your first works about Vidal and the tradition and the new geography and so on, what is your recollection of the spirit of the times then, as far as geography and related subjects is concerned?
Yes, my recollection is that it was a time when the French geographers were very proud of their achievements, and the young geographers, as I was, were a bit critical and a bit skeptical about what has been done during the last 30 years. During the 1950s, the late 1950s, I discovered economics, and I spent 4 years studying economics after leaving the university. I have an interest in macroeconomy and microeconomics, and I was reading what has been produced by some French economists in the field of location theory. And I decided to import in geography a part of what has been done in economics, and more specifically in location theory. And so I discovered that my interests were quite the same than the interest of people like Brian Berry at that time. And so I thought that it was good to have an experience of developing relations between geography and economics, but at the same time have also experiences of teaching geography. And for the students, the feeling I had of something which was imperfect was confirmed. It was quite evident for the students, specifically for the non-geographer students, that human geography, as it was taught in the French university, was not good for them. They do not understand the relations between the different parts of the subject. And I discovered that the best way to give them the sense of the usefulness of the interest of geography was just to tell them the way it was built. And so it was possible to understand the reason for which at the beginning of the 20th century the idea of genre de vie, of way of life, was so important, and for what reason it had ceased to be significant. But I think that for many students, since it had ceased to be significant, there was only criticism, and I think that it was possible to show them that something has to be saved out of this old lore, out of the Widlerian tradition. And so at the same time, I began to be critical to the Widlerian geography which has been practiced in the 1940s and 1950s. And I was, in some way, moving back towards what was really practiced at the time of Vidal de la Blache. I think that it was a rediscovery at that time of the curiosities and of the aims of geography at the beginning of this century.
Yes. Well, I think that that illustrates what I've always taken to be one of your gifts, that is to combine reference to tradition with change, and to be some kind of link, as I see it, between the French tradition of former times and new developments. But how did it work in the 1960s, which was a very troubled period in French universities?
I think that in the 1960s it was difficult to have these ideas accepted, because the French geographical establishment was rather conservative. But at the same time, it was possible to have the freedom to launch new avenues. It was perhaps not the best way to have consideration, but there was enough freedom in the system for young people to develop new ideas, so it was not so bad.
Yes.
It was certainly difficult for me and for perhaps 20 or 30 young geographers, but we could develop new ideas. The main problem was the lack of desire of change in the majority of young geographers. It was much more a problem of mentality than a problem of control by the older part of the older geographers. And I think that 1968, the student upheaval was certainly important because it allows for more freedom, and I think that after 1968, new orientations in quantitative geography began to be significant. At the beginning of the 1960s, people with an interest in the new geography are mainly interested in theory. And so they look towards economics and have no interest in the kind of empirical developments which were prominent in the 1940s and 1950s. As a result, the quantitative revolution in France in France was delayed until the end of the 1960s and the beginning of the 1970s. So I think it's one of the major differences, and I think that there are more interest in the theoretical roots of human geography than in the ways to develop new methodologies. Some interest, but it was not essential. It's certainly one of the differences between American or English and French geography at that time.
Yes. Well, that leads me to the next question, which was, I gather that about that time in the early 70s, you made your major debut, shall we say, into the English language and into America, the Anglo-Saxon world. I mean, you've become very much known since then in the Anglophone world, but do I understand that about 1972 you had an experience which changed your life?
Yes, I attended the international meeting in Montreal at that time, and Anne Buttimer told me that David Fessor would be glad to receive me, and so I decided to spend a weekend in Syracuse. And I came to Syracuse on the Friday morning, and David Fessor met me, was very kind, and we visited his university, his office, his library on the Indian census, and then at 2 o'clock he pushed a door, and there were about 40 students in the room, and he told me, "Here are the people who are waiting for your lecture. There are 2 hours for you," and I've no preparation at all, and so I have to speak in English for 2 hours, and it was certainly a very, very difficult experience for me. But I've read a lot of English. I've known the practice of English, and I think that it was very important for me because I discovered that I was able to speak. I think that it was difficult for me, and certainly much more difficult for the American students who were exposed to my English for 2 hours and then spent 8 hours speaking with me after that. After that time, yes, I visited several times Canada, French Canada, but I traveled in North America. I was invited by the Royal Geographical Society to visit some British university in 1990. I was invited in New Zealand, in Australia, and in the States, and so I've more and more experiences of the British, American, Canadian, and Australian and New Zealand geography.
Yes.
So I think that I began to have perhaps not a world view of geography, but a view of what was going on in France and in some other European countries, mainly Italy, Spain, and Portugal. Have some ideas of what was going on in Germany because of close relations with people like Dietrich Bartels, and with some also Dutch geographers. And I read, and I began to have the possibility to discover the British or American geographers. And for me, it was very interesting because when you are reading what is new, there is a delay. When you read a paper which is really new, it's so new that it's difficult for you to assess its real importance. And so it's better to have the possibility to meet the people, to ask them questions. And so after 1972, I think that it was easier for me to understand what was going on in the radical geography or in the phenomenological movement in North America or in Britain. And so my ties were closer with the Anglo-Saxon geography after 1972.
Yes. Well, obviously you were, as we say, you were thrown into the deep end of the pool to learn English, and you survived and swam with English in the Anglophone world, as you do in international conferences. And I would like to ask you, what over the last decade or so of rather close following of what you might call generally Anglo-Saxon, à la de Gaulle geography, what is your opinion of it in relation to French geography?
I think that there was a lot of interest among French geographers in the kind of developments which were important and significant in America or in Britain. But I think that the attitudes were different for different reasons. In the field of radical geography, the French geographers had an experience of Marxism in the late 1950s. And so they were generally skeptical about the new Marxist developments. And so the importance of radical geography was lesser than it was elsewhere. French geographers have an interest in inequalities and equality. They have the same curiosities, but they didn't think that Marxist theory was good to provide an efficient framework for geography. So it's one of the differences. And the other difference is that we are a bit skeptical about pure phenomenology. We are speaking of l'espace vécu, the lived experience of space. And I think that we have an interest in more collective way of perceiving the things, more interest in the cultural determination of perception than on the personal experience of particular individuals. And we had the feeling that the geography in America and in Britain was very rich with a lot of experiences. But at the same time, we got the feeling that it was more a juxtaposition of different fields without unifying themes. And I think that by now, after 20 years of crisis, 20 years during which it was necessary to look for new ideas, to build new methods, it's possible to move back to the traditional themes of geography, but with a deeper understanding of the reasons, of the causes, of the general framework of explanation. And so I think that it's possible to build something which is a new geography. And this new geography is not an economic one. It's not built only on quantitative methods, just like people were thinking in the 1960s. It's a social geography, because we're dealing with people, we're dealing with groups. But social geography is not enough, because the individuals have values, and so it's necessary to look at the values, at the culture. And I think that the evolution of geography is a three steps evolution from geography as a natural science in the 1950s still, to geography as a social sciences in the 1960s, with the deep involvement in economics and in sociology. In the 1970s, I spent a lot of time trying to import in geography what was produced in sociology and in anthropology, and I'm now working much more on anthropology, and it's significant for geography. And the last period, the third phase, is a phase in which we are dealing with the values, that is humanistic geography. And I think that it's possible to have a better structured view of geography in this way.
Yes. Well, that's certainly what I think, if I remember rightly, you end up in the book that you and Johnston jointly edited on international geography now, that you ended up with that trilogy or a succession from physical to social to geography as a humanity. Well, I've also heard you say that perhaps there's a kind of circle here, that you come back now, perhaps in French geography, to the tradition modified by subsequent events.
Yes, we are coming back to an interest in the different cultures and the different regions, but I think that in the 1950s we're still thinking that the physical environment was the major components in the explanations we could provide. And by now I think that we are looking much more in the history, in the values. So I think that it's a circle, but it's much more a spiral.
Yes.
We're moving around the same themes, but at the same time there is some progression of methods, and it's the reason for which I'm rather optimistic on the evolution of human geography during the next years, at least when I'm trying to compare human geography to the other social sciences. I think that the epistemology of human geography was not well established, well founded at the beginning of the 1960s, and the feeling of a crisis. I think that this feeling is no more. It was an important to have this kind of attitude 20 years ago. I think that by now it's more important just to build a new geography out of the parts which were developed during the last 20 years. And so I'm more optimistic. And in France, the image of geography among social geographers, which has deteriorated, which was not a very good one in the late 1960s and in the 1970s, is by now better than it was 10 years or 15 years ago.
So, well, to sum up, my perception is of you as a mitigated optimist. I know you are a very careful person generally, weighing your words, and there is a great deal of pessimism among geographical circles, I think, at least in America, where I am now. But I'd like to ask you how you see the practical future and prospects for geography in France, including its image and its impact on the general public.
Yes, I think that if the situation of geography among the social sciences is better, its situation in the academic world is not so good for many reasons. In France, like in America, universities are poorer than they were 15 years ago, and there is a necessity to save money. And I think that a discipline with a tradition in humanities is more vulnerable than a discipline which is much more harder. And I think it's one of the problems of geography in France. I think that within the next few years, the possibility of further expansion will be at stake. I am not sure of the issue. I think, for example, that in the world of publishing, it's more difficult to have books on geography published than 20 years ago, because it's necessary to sell more copies, and the market for geographical books is a stable one, and so it's more difficult for us. So there are some dark side in the situation. I think that geography will be certainly different. I think that a good deal of it will be sold in the universities in other departments than in the departments of geography. For example, we have new curricula in France for developing the ability to deal with special problems, and in this curricula, geographers, economics, urbanists are working together. And I think that it's certainly on this line that geography will survive. And it's difficult for geographers to make the jump to this new situation. I think that in some ways the situation in America is not so different. And when you are speaking of the disappearance of geography in such departments as Chicago, I think that it's possible in America because you are in a more flexible structure. But when you see in France the reduction of the place given to geography in some institutions, it's really...
How is it in the schools, for instance?
In the schools and in the high school, the place of geography is still important. There was some plans in the 1970s to reduce this importance, but fortunately for us, in France there is a close association between history and geography. And at the time when it was decided to reduce the time devoted to history, all the political men in France, from the right or from the left, began to think that it was certainly not a good thing, and so geography was saved because history was saved.
Yes.
And I think that geography is not in a very good position, but until now it was not. It was decided that if there have to be more more history, there will be also a bit more geography.
Yes.
So the situation in the schools is until now not so bad.
Well, you should comfort yourself that relatively that is much better than the United States, where there is really no geography in most high schools, but there is history, and it hasn't helped. The history has somehow swallowed geography, but not made use of it. And so there's a real problem, which is not the French problem.
Yeah, I think that it's very important to have these kind of possibilities, and many of our students are teaching geography. But at the same time, the university is linked to the programs of the secondary schools who have to prepare our students to be teachers. It was the only possibilities offered to them until 15 years ago. By now it's a bit different. It's possible for them to work in planning agencies. But as a result, I think that the adaptation of French geography to newer trends, to new opportunities, was certainly less quick. And a good deal of the conservatism of French geography in the 1960s is linked to the place of geography in the secondary school. The secondary school teachers have a view of geography which is difficult to change. And so it's a process of about 20 or 30 years to change this view of geography, when you have to change the view of the majority of teachers in the secondary school system. And so it's a mitigated advantage to have a strong position in the secondary school system. But one of the major aspects of this importance is that there is an interest in the general public in France for places. It's not really geography, but it's an interest in the local arts and the differences in the landscapes. And when you look at the way people travel in France, I think that there are more geographers as travelers than many people elsewhere. And when we compare tourists in places like Costa Brava, the behavior of the different nations in the same place is different. And in my experience, French tourists are spending much more time looking at the different places and visiting different possibilities than the majority of other European tourists. And so I think that it's one of the major results of the major achievements of the French geography.
Yes. Well, that's very interesting, because we've heard in this Barcelona conference a lot about the influence and delayed influence of such things as the Géographie universelle from previous times in France. There is still a latent need for that, which might be in a new guise made very accessible and even exciting to the public. Problems and different parts of the world and really lively topics with geographers.
I think that it is a possibility, and some of the French colleagues, more specifically Roger Brunet, is launching a new venture in Géographie universelle, and I hope that it will be a good occasion to develop a new conscience of what is geography among the general public. But we have to wait for the way these new series will be received by the general public.
And do you think of geography in the future as, in France, as primarily an educational, cultural subject, or more an applied, practical subject?
I think that both phases of geography are important in the future. In the universities, I think that applied geography will be certainly more important, because when we got students, they want to have a job. And so it's difficult not to deliver something which is useful for their life. But more and more we're spending our time for the kind of education continue, the
Yes,
kind of
continuing
permanent
education,
education, which offer us a lot of opportunities to explain what is humanistic geography. And I think that this kind of teaching is more and more important, and a good deal, perhaps 20 or 30% of the time in the French departments of geography is by now devoted to this type of teaching. And it's certainly much more humanistic view on the world and the comparisons of the different civilizations, which is popular at that level for that type of teaching than the more technical ways of presenting geography. So I think that both of the orientations will develop, but at different levels. In the departments of geography, the technical skills will be certainly prominent in the next few years.
And what about the undoubted French tradition, which is still there, of literary geography, let's say the Vidal's Tableau de la Géographie de la France, which was very, very popular among a wide range. It's still there, and if it's excited, if the public is excited, do you think that geographers can rise to the occasion and provide the product?
Unfortunately, I think that the standards in French writing is by no lower than it was 30 years ago. Some geographers are thinking that it's very important, and as I'm growing older and older, I'm spending more and more time on the way I'm writing my texts, because I think it's a privilege to have the opportunity to be published.
Yes.
And so I'm spending more and more time in writing and rewriting. And I know many of my colleagues with such an interest, but I think that really there are few French geographers who are really with literature in mind. Some people have this orientation, like Frémont, who has written beautiful texts on French peasantry. People like Tissier, who has an interest in the kind of geography which was practiced by novelists. For example, Julien Gracq, who is a very well-known novelist, but he's also a professional geographer. And some of the best French written by geographers was written by French Canadians. For example, by Luc Bureau. His French is a fantastic one, and so I think that we have to look to the French written by Canadians, by West Africans, by Arabians. Sometimes are writing a better French than we do.
Yes, I know how it is. Well, you've certainly made use of the privilege, as you put it, of publishing, written a very great many books that have come out over the last 20 years and have influenced a great many people, and more in the Anglo-Saxon world as well as the European and French world. And I would like to ask what plans do you have for future writing?
Oh, I think that it's important to provide the public with views on geography which are more accessible than the general statements on the discipline. And so I'm working on an essay on what are the specificities of the North American space. It's a kind of regional geography, but it's different of the way regional geography was written on 40 or 50 years ago. So I'm working on this essay. I hope that it will be published within the next 18 months. And on a more academic field, I think that there is a research frontier in the field of cultural geography. And so I'm working on cultural geography. I'm working also on an essay on the history of human geography before the birth of human geography at the end of the 18th century. What were the ways the people developed in the 16th, 17th and 18th century to plan, to colonize, to build houses, to build gardens, to have something which will be used by man? What kind of criteria were used to give authority to the councils which were given by the different peoples. And so it's the kind of things which are of interest for me, but it's not very easy to find evidence, and so it's asked me much more time than I thought when I
Well, in that context, I know that you are an admirer of Fernand Braudel. Is it that kind of thing that you wish had been done by a geographer rather than a historian, but of course he's a geographer too, perhaps?
He was a geographer, and his last book, Identité de la France, is an essay on the historical geography of France and on the significance of this history for Frenchmen. I think that we have to try to develop this kind of humanistic view on geography if we wish to gain more influence among the cultivated elite in France. And I think that it's a good idea for us to look at the way people like Duby or Braudel are writing essays, are writing books that are so well written and so interesting that they manage to give a larger and larger audience, bigger, broader and broader audience to geography, to historical geography, to history. And it's up to us to develop the same kind of experience by now.
Would you also include Leroy-Ladurie, Montaillou, that kind of thing, to some extent?
Yes, and I think that when I'm speaking with Leroy-Ladurie, it told me that what is perhaps more significant in present-day society is the taste for the local things, for the local scale, and I think that a renewed interest in monographs, not the kind of passepartout monographs which were developed in the 1930s, but the kind of imaginative monographs which were produced, for example, by Leroy-Ladurie in Montaillou, will be helpful for us. Unfortunately, very few geographers have an interest in this kind of monograph, except perhaps when they're dealing with West Africa, with the Pacific Islands, and there are good studies by people like Bonmaison on the Pacific Islands. I think that some geographers are developing these orientations.
Well, I think that is a very full discussion that we've had, and it's basically a very potentially optimistic scenario that you do paint, and it seems that you would agree that geography has a need for it, that the problems are becoming geographical in our lives all the time, and need to know the world and to need to know back into history what places were like and so on. All of these things are not something that can disappear very easily, and that the French tradition, suitably modified, will be ready for the task. Is that...
I have this feeling. I think that in the 1960s, with the progress of techniques, we got the feeling of the world becoming more and more uniform, and we discover that it's not sufficient to have the same kind of car to have something which is uniform. We have people are building a new sense of identity. They try to develop their feeling of identity in stressing the differences between one place to the other. It means that geography is significant, and perhaps more significant now than it was 20 or 30 years ago. It's one of the reasons for which I'm relatively optimistic for geography, because geography makes more sense for the general public, but we have to show it to the general public.
Well, that is the paradox, it seems, not only in France, but certainly in America, that the problems are becoming geographical more and more, and people recognize them when they are told about them. But before they are told about them, they have not thought, at least in America, that they are geographical, and they get very interested. So it becomes a matter of instruction, education, and by example. And
Yes, it's
People like you are in the vanguard of leading the new attack on to become part of public awareness.
I think it's one of the major aspects in the evolution of geography. More and more geography in the daily life of the majority of people, and less consciousness of what could be afforded by the geographical discipline. It's our major problem, not so different in France and in the United States.
Yes. Well, I thank you very much, Paul, for this very illuminating talk, and I think encouraging too.
Thank you very much, David.
Right.